After the temple fell, sacrifice didn't disappear, it evolved. See, when Jerusalem fell and the smoke had cleared, something changed forever. See, the priests were gone. The altar lay in ruins, and the Jewish people had to ask, how do we worship without a temple? What emerged from exile was not the same faith that Moses taught in the wilderness, because that faith had passed through Persia, Greece, and Rome. And by the time Jesus entered the story, that roadway looked very different. So let's go to 586 BCE. Babylon destroyed Solomon's temple, and it was a catastrophe. The priesthood was scattered, sacrifices ceased, and many were simply deported. However, when the nation came under Persian rule, beginning with Cyrus the Great in 539 BCE, a new pathway opened. The Jews were allowed to return, but many didn't. Those who stayed in exile became the first true diaspora Jews, worshippers without a temple. However, in Persia, something else also began to change, and the Jewish faith began to drift. Now, sacrifices were replaced with learning, priests were replaced or took the role of scribes, and the covenant was kept alive through scrolls initially. Let's consider some key texts in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, where the focus was on the Torah, the written law, instead of being on these altar rituals. When we look at Ezra chapter 7 and verses 25 and 26, we read, "And you, Ezra, according to the wisdom of your God, which you possess, are to appoint magistrates and judges to judge all the peoples west of the Euphrates, all who know the laws of your God. And you are to teach these laws to everyone who does not know them. If anyone does not keep the law of your God and the law of the king, let a strict judgment be executed against them, whether death, banishment, confusion, confiscation of property, or imprisonment." And then again, confirming that in Nehemiah 8 in verses 1 through to 3. At that time, all the peoples gathered together in the square before the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. Now, on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly of men and women and all who could listen and understand. So Ezra read it aloud from daybreak until noon as he faced the square before the water gate in front of the men and women and those who could understand. Now, when you compare these instructions with the instructions from Moses in Deuteronomy 31 and verse 12, you will see clearly how both Ezra and Nehemiah were in their determination to return the nation back to the covenant arrangement. However, once again, and sadly, we can notice how drift soon began to influence them. Now, in this time of the king Artaxerxes, just a few short years from the completion of the temple, what do we find? In Esther 9 and verse 20 and 23, which we covered in the last video, they actually introduced a new festival into their worship, paralleling what? A Persian festival. The influence of the Persian religion, especially Zoroastrianism, left deep marks. Cosmic dualism. Okay, that's a fancy way of describing good versus evil, light versus darkness. And do we see the echoes of that in John's Gospel? Then there was a personified Satan as an enemy of God. Now, this is absent in the early Torah. Angels and demons with names and hierarchies. Belief in a coming age, a final judgment, and bodily resurrection. See, these concepts were largely absent in Moses' covenant, but they began to appear powerfully in the book of Daniel and other post-exilic writings. In future videos, we will consider how, in Genesis, for example, the Satan mentioned is really a questioning figure. Is it really so that God? Yeah. In Zechariah and in Job, now these are post-exilic writings, Satan becomes an accuser, not just asking a question. Then we have Daniel. He introduces Michael and the resurrection of the dead. See, these ideas led the groundwork really for what would later become and described as Second Temple apocalyptic dogmas. And they deeply shaped the expectations of the coming Messiah. See, after Persia, the Jewish worlds collided with Greek thought and culture. See, when Alexander the Great conquered the region in the 4th century BCE, what did he bring? He brought the Greek language. He brought the philosophical method of interpreting Scripture, not the allowing of Scripture to interpret themselves. And there was this love of reason and rhetoric, worldly sort of thinking. Oh, yes. And new concepts of the soul and afterlife and cosmos. Now, many Jews embraced all of this. And by the time of the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Jewish faith was being interpreted through a Hellenistic lens, the Greek influence. Key shifts in worship ensued. Direct obedience to the law of Moses was replaced with some sort of abstract ethics. Again, this wisdom of the world creeping in. Concepts like the immortal soul entered into Jewish thinking. Wisdom became a personified figure, as in Proverbs, and later echoed where? In John's Gospel, the Logos. Now, some resisted this corruption of the Torah because about 100 years or so later, the Maccabees' rebellion actually bore against this. And the fruit that came out of that was the Passover and Jubilee celebration began to be celebrated again. But by now, of course, the Greek influence was irreversible. It shaped the Jewish sects like the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, each of them offering different interpretations of the law and the role of sacrifice. Torah versus Logos. Wisdom literature compared to the Greek Logos. By the time Jesus was born, the Romans now ruled the land. The temple was renovated, but now it was a political and economic engine. You see, Herod's temple was a massive and grand renovation project that lasted about 46 years or so, beginning in about 19 BCE. However, it was closely tied to the Roman system of control. The priesthood, especially the Sadducees, had become the administrators of sacrifice, but under the eye of Rome. And the sacrifices were expensive, they were regulated, and they were tied to taxes and the temple commerce. And yet, the ordinary people often felt cut off from the holiness that they were told to purchase through animals via the priests. Then Jesus enters this world, not just to forgive sins, but to challenge the entire system. Remember Jesus' actions, driving out the money changers, the merchants. Mark chapters 11, verses 15 through to 17, and then quoting the prophets, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, Hosea 6 and verse 6. We have covered all of this in previous videos. He also predicted the destruction of the temple. We'll cover that in another video. See, Jesus wasn't restoring the sacrificial system. No. He was calling it out as obsolete. A call that was rooted not just in the law and the prophets, but also in the scathing indictments of the long tradition of post-exilic transformation that had taken place right up to his time. So what does this all mean? See, the Jewish world into which Jesus was born had already been reshaped. The Persians gave Jews a cosmic story of good versus evil. The Greeks thought gave them tools to interpret scriptures. Wait for it. Interpret philosophically. Wisdom of the world again. Rome turned temple sacrifice into politics and profit. Jesus, however, stood in the tradition of the prophets, but also in the shadow of the post-exilic transformation that had already taken place. And it was a dark shadow. He didn't just ignore sacrifice. No, he redefined it in harmony with what we know today as the book of Deuteronomy. Blood on an altar, but mercy towards each other. Not rituals in a temple, but justice for the oppressed. Priestly mediation, but personal transformation of the heart. Now, let us remind ourselves of all the all-encompassing direction from Jesus himself found in all three of the synoptic gospels, where each time in a context where he is calling his followers to radical self-denial. Matthew 16 and verse 24. Then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And again in Mark 8 and verse 34. Then Jesus called the crowd to him along with his disciples, and he told them, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. Now, interestingly, Luke's version uniquely adds the word daily, emphasizing an ongoing commitment. Let's read that. Luke chapter 9 and verse 23. Then Jesus said to all of them, if anyone wants to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. And then finally, Matthew 9 and verse 13. Remember this? Remember it? But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. For I have come not to call the righteous, but sinners. Now, as he is quoting from Hosea 6 and verse 6, let's just recap that. Hosea 6 and verse 6. For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. That's clear enough, is it not? Our conduct toward all has to be based on our knowledge of God as revealed in His Word, and not some form of worship based on ritual. The road from exile to Jesus was long and full of change. But the deeper thread is this. See, God's desire was never for blood, but for the hearts to turn toward Him, displaying justice and mercy and love toward all, and in particular toward each other. Now, in the next part of this journey, we will ask, what happened after Jesus? Why did Paul return to the language of sacrifice? And how did the early church reinterpret the cross or stake? Was it in fact a cross, or was it an upright stake? Well, we'll have a separate video on that shortly. Now, to the next leg of the long road of sacrifice. And that will complete the entire framework in which the Bible narrative can be understood. See, but remember, it is just a framework, and the future episodes will fill in all the necessary backgrounds, and more importantly, the treasures hidden in the field of Matthew 13 and verse 44. Remember that? So, until the next time, if you have any thoughts, please use the comment section. We'd love to hear from you. And if you find this of interest, please like, subscribe, and share with others. See, this helps the algorithms to put out to a larger viewership. So, thank you very much, and see you next time.